It all started with a view of reality. Because yes, the first movies were mostly documentaries. We used the novelty that was the cinema to film real life, to show in movement things that we could not see at home. Soon, the first fiction movies appeared, using the codes of the theater to tell stories. Among these, there were pieces with a humoristic purpose. First comical movies were simple and short movies, generally based on a single joke. The context of the gag was often stupidity. So it was natural that little by little, children became the main characters. Interestingly, there is no moral. This is one of the foundations of what slapstick will become, a subversive, even violent genre. Political correctness leagues were quick to complain and to challenge this image of the unpunished, rebellious child. Older characters therefore replaced the children, but this changed the principle of the movies very little. The heroes, now young adults, are just big children. They are clumsy, shy, have trouble with women, and are afraid of authority. The heroes of those movies spend their time making trouble. It's then quite natural that their opponent represents the contrary, stability and order. Thus, the policemen become little by little the regular antagonist of these movies. The chase between them and the hero are then almost inevitable. In 1912, the director Max Sennett took over the direction of the Keaton studio in Hollywood. At the head of the studio, he was quickly called the King of Comedy. He made slapstick extremely popular and launched the greatest future stars of the genre, such as Charlie Chaplin, Roscoe Arbuckle, or Harry Langdon. In the second half of the 1910s, Charlie Chaplin and Roscoe Arbuckle were on top of the podium. They are the two great stardom of slapstick movies. In 1917, a young 22-year-old vaudeville star joined Roscoe Arbuckle's team at the Studio Comic Films. His name is Buster Keaton. The latter has been on the board since his early childhood. He formed with his two parents a successful trio, the Three Keatons. During their comedy shows, Buster's father, Joe Keaton, would abuse and throw his son from one end of the stage to the other to make the audience laugh. If this is considered immoral, Buster was fine with it. It amused him. He had quickly learned how to fall without getting hurt anyway. And then, he would have the opportunity to take revenge later on. You could say that he had always been destined for slapstick. It was also at this time that he realized something fundamental. If he showed that he was having fun when he fell, the public would laugh less. That's when he decided to adopt an impassive face that never laughed. We can see him here in his very first movie appearance alongside Roscoe Arbuckle in a small role in The Butcher Boy. We also see his professional stunt skills. Arbuckle quickly became Keaton's friend and mentor. He taught him the craft of movie making and acting. Despite a stint in the army for Keaton, he participated in several short movies of Arbuckle between 1917 and 1919. In some of his movies, we can see the rare times when Keaton leaves his impassive face, where the fun seems to take over. As the work progressed, Keaton's place in the movies became more and more important. In 1919, Arbuckle was hired by Paramount, and Keaton was chosen to replace him at the Studio Comic Films. He thus became a director. Between 1920 and 1923, he directed 19 short movies, and between 1923 and 1928, he directed 11 feature movies. To start talking about Keaton's cinema, the most obvious subject is his stunts. Even though stunts are present in all slapstick movie makers, Keaton is clearly the one who gives them the most space. Some of his stunts are simply amazing. If he did almost all his stunts himself, and he probably did one of the most impressive stunts in the history of cinema, the legend saying that he never used any trickery to do them is false. The idea here is not to destroy his reputation. He did perform almost all of his stunts. And this one is still totally crazy. All the ones you see here since the beginning are made without tricks. Nevertheless, to say that they are all true remain a lie. Today, some tricks are even very simple to notice. We see for example here that there is a cut and that there is a dummy attached to the top of the tree. On the other hand, Keaton could take the place of other actors in his own movies to perform their stunts himself. Take this scene for example. Keaton's character is at the front of the motorcycle. In the next shot, it's actually Keaton who plays the driver to make the fall. For the connoisseurs, we can clearly recognize his gestures. Ironically, we can say that the sequence is rigged so that Keaton does even more stunts. We'll come back to the tricks later. The fact that he does almost all of his stunts necessarily influences his direction. He can show his stunts without cuts and without close-ups that would hide certain tricks. For him, close-ups cut the action, so he almost systematically uses wide shots, where the action can live and evolve on its own. Pursuing this idea of showing the action at its best, he always chooses the framing that best brings it forward. It's always difficult to talk about a good framing, because by definition this one seems very intuitive, as if it was obvious that it had to be done this way. However, for each scene there is a variety of possible framing. Look for example at this scene. In the same shot, we see the two characters falling symmetrically at the same time. Keaton even looks up as if he could see what was happening above. Since Keaton is actually doing the action, he doesn't need to cut the moment when he catches the rain gutter, and so in only 3 shots he shows 5 different actions, which gives a lot of rhythm to the action. The 2 floors of the shot 3 could have been shown in 2 different shots, but that would have completely destroyed the rhythm of the sequence. Here, it's almost musical. Everything happens exactly when it should happen. Before going further, it seems important to me to come back to slapstick and the different notions that compose it. It's a much codified genre. Everything is based on gags, body and movement. The story, even if it doesn't matter, almost always tells the same thing, an outcast who ends up adapting. Buster Keaton used to say, jokingly, that it's always a hero who, to conquer a woman, must compete with a villain. Even if this structure comes back very often, it is far from being systematic, but it shows a few things. Apart from the hero, the other characters are only pretext for action and gags. There is no real story in the sense that there is no evolution of the characters. Besides, the movies are often shot without a script. Everything starts from a gag, and the rest is built around it. The low importance of the story in these movies make each scene enjoyable without context, without any attachment to the characters. There is an obviousness and a universality. That's why today some teachers decide to show this kind of movie in elementary school to students who are not interested in cinema. They are much less categorized by the public as old silent movies that have aged than other genres. There is a fascinating aspect to watch these characters who don't seem to know what to do with their bodies, played by actors with total mastery of their gestures. In slapstick, there is what I call stretching. As the important thing is the humor and not the story, any situation, any place, any object is seen as an infinite comical potential from which we must draw the maximum. We stretch the situation as far as possible. In the duration, it clearly created short movies in part. Here we are totally free from the narrative rules. For example, let's take this scene. Keaton wants to run away with his beloved who lives across the street, but he can't join her because her parents are on the ground floor. Let's note again the perfect framing of the situation. One would think that the idea of the pyramid that stops here is good enough to work like that, but no, he goes back first for the luggage. You'd think it would stop once he got his wife back, but no, Mise is being spotted. Then it goes on a chase, and then there are obstacles. Then the pyramid decreases, and then it decreases again. What could have been a simple oppressive shot of a human pyramid has been stretched to the maximum to use all the possibilities of this situation. Another important notion is the gag. Today this term has become the equivalent of a joke, but it's not the same thing. This, for example, is not a gag. On the contrary, this is a gag. A gag is actually a surprise to the viewer's expectations. A gag therefore has a precise structure and must be in at least two stages: preparation, surprise. We expect Keaton to block the door with his arm, but he doesn't. It is by playing and combining the stretch and the gag that the slapstick finds all its interests. These two notions are almost paradoxical, one based on surprise and the other on redundancy. Thus, the audience is always wondering how the character will continue to interact with the situation. When it thinks it has figured out what is going to happen, it's in the end to be better surprised by a gag. There is a real playfulness between the spectator and the movie, and this is something that slapstick directors have understood well. Thus, a gag playing on stretch does not necessarily have only two parts. You never know when it will end. A slapstick movie constantly plays with our expectations. A banana peel in the middle of the road, Keaton will obviously fall on it. Actually, no, he doesn't. Keaton needs an object to keep the car in balance. He takes a simple balloon, the latter being visible from the beginning. That he uses it is both totally unbelievable and totally obvious. Keatonian gag often follows this structure. Keaton is in a difficult situation, but ends up turning this situation to his advantage. The first swordfish attacks him, he uses his nose to have a fencing duel with the second. Keaton gets hit, he staggers to the ground and knocks down his opponent unintentionally. This catches up, in fact, the very basis of the slapstick. Characters rejected by an environment who ends up adapting to it. It is interesting to note how Keaton plays with all the possibilities that cinema offers. He plays with the sets, he splits himself in several ways, he uses slow motion to simulate the change of gravity. He uses editing to make original ellipses, absurd frame within the frame. He breaks the fourth wall by playing with the spectator. He makes subjective shots, etc., etc. All these processes were not invented by Keaton and had already been done before. But it doesn't seem to me that I have seen as much in the other slapstick stars of the time. Since the beginning of the video, I have often said that slapstick was popular at the time. It was the case, but only for the working classes. The elite despised slapstick. For them, it was only a sequence of vulgar stupidity. The cinema in itself had become prestigious only for a few years. Indeed, until the beginning of the 1910s, the cinema interested only the popular classes, and the movies were projected only in fairs or in small cinema called Nickelodeon. The latter was small, uncomfortable, and the tickets were cheap. They showed short movies by the dozen. So we were not going to see a movie in particular, but movies. Around 1913, many feature movies from Europe, and especially from Italy, changed the deal. They were long movies, sometimes reaching 3 hours, with huge sets, thousands of extras, an epic story, and were especially inspired by other prestigious arts like theater or literature. Even if there were already feature movies in the United States, these movies of a completely different ambition were an immense success in the US. It was a real revolution. The Americans decided to do the same. In 1915, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation was released. It was totally based on the Italian formula, adapted from a book, with great battle scenes, thousands of extras, and an enormous duration. It was projected in big prestigious theaters and accompanied by orchestras and animations. Tickets became much more expensive. This, plus the fact that this kind of movie was inspired by other prestigious arts, naturally provoked the interest of the elites. But before going any further, we have to go back to the notion of feature movies. At the time, we were not talking about the length of a movie in minutes, but the number of reels. To project a movie, it was necessary to turn a crank manually. The speed at which the movie was projected depended on the pace of the projectionist. In other words, for the same movie, the duration was not exactly the same from one session to another. That's why we don't talk about duration. A reel represented about 10 to 15 minutes of a movie. And at that time, a movie was considered a feature movie from 4 reels, so about 45 minutes, which is less than the current standards. At the time, partly because of what we have just seen, the word feature was not limited to the sense of duration, but also of quality. In other words, we considered that a feature was a movie that lasted long because it deserved it. It was therefore a proof of quality. A feature is therefore, of course, a movie of 4 reels or more, but is above all considered as a prestigious movie. At the end of the 1910s, there were almost no features movie in slapstick. There were a few, but punctually and without success. The standard for slapstick is 2 reels, so about 20 minutes. For these reasons, critics and intellectuals consider that the slapstick feature is not possible. It will only be a series of gags with no real story. In short, for them, slapstick doesn't deserve to become a feature movie. But briefly, for slapstick, the shift from short to feature movie has a real stake of legitimacy and prestige. Slapstick movies will become more and more popular in the 1920s. This can be explained economically. In the early 1920s, the great slapstick directors were more powerful than ever. Their commercial success with the general public during the previous decade allowed them to obtain their own studio. They now had total freedom and artistic independence. In 1921, Chaplin's The Kid was released. As I said before, it's not the first slapstick feature movie, but it's the first one that will be so successful. It will really launch the fashion of the slapstick feature movie, and it will become a standard during the 1920s. The movie tells the story of Charlie, a homeless man who decides to take care of a child abandoned in the street. It has a structure and characters quite different from the classic slapstick. The center of the movie is no longer the gags, but the relationship between the two characters. No more villain or woman to conquer as a pretext. We get attached to them and have a real evolution. The movie is a comedy as well as a melodrama, especially with the famous scene where the policeman kidnapped Charlie's child. Even if the character Charlie remains himself, he is obliged to show maturity and to teach to the child the right ways. The latter, of course, spends his time making fools. The child doing silly things, like the origins of slapstick. By the way, I've never read a text that confirms this, but I've always found it interesting in a genre based on immaturity and stupidity. The first great movie to become a feature movie, and therefore for the time a mature and prestigious movie, was precisely a movie about education. Wouldn't this finally be the new Chaplin straightening out the old Chaplin who was content with a movie without stakes? The Kid is a huge success and a great movie, but isn't borrowing from the melodrama for the first feature movie of the genre an admission of failure of slapstick? Doesn't that give reason to the bad language? Would it really be impossible to make a classic slapstick last the length of a feature movie? In fact, the Americans had the answer quite quickly. A few months later, A Sailor-Made Man with Harold Lloyd was released, first feature movie of the actor. It has the particularity of being an accidental feature movie. It was originally supposed to be a 2-reel movie, but the crew was so happy with what they were producing that they kept shooting to get the length of a feature movie. Proof once again that slapstick is a kind of intuitive movie, made in the moment, and for which writing is almost non-existent. The movie has not changed at all in relation to the transition to a full-length movie, nor to its duration. There is therefore nothing more than a normal slapstick, pretextual and non-existent characters, series of gags, and yet it works perfectly in the duration. The classic formula of slapstick works well over the length of a feature movie, but that doesn't stop a long slapstick from being conceived in the same way as a short. It needs to reflect the codes of the genre without betraying them. Let's see how Keaton thought about his feature movies by analyzing 3 of them. Being less popular than the two other movie makers mentioned, he only made his first feature movie in 1923. Moreover, it seems to me important to insist on it, because yes, today the two famous stars of slapstick are Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. We like to imagine them as great rivals, but it was never the case. Buster Keaton at the time never had the popularity of Chaplin. In the 1910s, it was Roscoe Arbuckle who rivaled Chaplin. And in the 1920s, it was Harold Lloyd who was his main rival. At the time, in terms of popularity, Keaton was certainly a star, but he was never on a par with Chaplin. His first feature movie is The Three Ages. It's a kind of parody of Griffith's movie Intolerance. It tells 3 times the same love story, but at different eras: prehistory, antiquity, and modern times. Through the work, the editing does not stop alternating between each era. Each of the 3 stories is the same. Keaton is in love with a woman, but he is double-crossed by his rival who is better than him. One of the great interests of the movie is to discover that there will be differences of treatment from one time to another. For example, in prehistoric times, his rival is better than him because he is physically stronger. In ancient times because he has a higher rank in the army, and in modern times because he is richer than him. Keaton also had fun placing anachronisms during the 2 eras of the past. For example, during the fabulous chariot race, Keaton uses a sled pulled by dogs. At one point, he will literally replace one of the injured dogs with a rescue dog. For a first feature movie, we can only salute Keaton's ambition. A movie in 3 eras therefore necessarily requires costumes, accessories, and especially totally different settings. Those of Rome in particular are really impressive. But where I find the movie most interesting is how, for a first feature movie, the movie totally assumed the slapstick, where Chaplin seemed to run away from it. As I said, the structure of each of the stories follows the classic slapstick structure. The hero, his rival, and a woman. Keaton assumes it and doesn't want more. He goes even further by proposing 3 variations of this same basic story. He pushes the stretch of slapstick to its paroxysm, except that it works perfectly. Where in a classic short movie the viewer wonders how the movie will continue to use a situation, here the viewer wonders how it will be used in the next era. And of course, Keaton will play with expectations to better thwart them. The movie is totally in line with the expectation surprises principle of slapstick. It's almost an adaptation of it. There is a rumor that, in case of failure, the movie could have been divided into 3 separate short movies, 1 per era. These 3 short movies could indeed work independently, but this will totally undermine the interest of the structure and the editing of the movie. I won't dwell on it, but for his second feature movie, Our Hospitality, Keaton will also use a little melodrama in a rather particular way, because it will be the case only in the prologue. Indeed, the prologue is extremely dark, probably the darkest scene of Keaton's career. We can see a father being murdered in front of his baby's eyes. The rest of the movie will be a classic slapstick and will not have any notion of melodrama. But this intro leaves hovering over the whole movie issues and relationships deeper than usual. The second movie I would like to focus on is his third feature movie, Sherlock Jr., released in 1924. It's for me his best movie. It tells the story of a projectionist who dreams about being a great detective. As usual, he wants to seduce the woman he loves, but his rival will prevent him. The latter accuses him of a theft that he did not commit. Rejected by all, he reclines in his projection room. He then starts to dream that he is literally entering a movie. By entering into his dream, he enters the world of fiction. He becomes Sherlock, a great detective. He will then of course foil all the traps of the villains and rescue his beloved. It's above all a movie on the cinema, the fiction, and the relationship that we can have with this last one. Indeed, the first part presents us with a loser who dreams of being a great detective. He fantasizes the fiction while being totally distant from it. It's a weight for him in comparison, who does not succeed at anything. Rejected in his real life, he decides to take refuge in fiction, a world that he idealizes. But he will be first rejected by it because the editing of the movie will try to trap him. He will end up adapting and shining in the fiction, to finally once awake use the fiction that he masters to help him in the real life. The movie deals with one of the great themes of slapstick, adaptation. Before going further, I would like to come back to the famous sequence where he enters the movie. The fiction tries to reject him by constantly changing his location. Look at the genius of the editing on this sequence. How did they manage to be so precise about Keaton's position in relation to the camera? They used geometric tools to be able to be so precise. But even knowing that, look at this connection, this precision, this fluidity in relation to the movement. It's real genius. As I said earlier, Keaton is a great stuntman and he likes to film the action as it is, without tricks and without cuts, to film reality. As Sherlock Jr. is a movie about fiction, he will take advantage of it to have fun with us. He will constantly play on the reality or not of the action, using different techniques. He has notably called on magicians who have taught him prestidigitation tricks. So we have 3 levels of reality. What is really done as is during the shooting, what is done during the shooting but with the help of magician tricks, and what is done during the post-production. From that, Keaton will have fun with our expectations. For example, there is the scene of the pool game. The villains have hidden an explosive ball among the others. The hero knows it. Sherlock will play alone because every time he will manage to score points without touching the explosive ball. These shots will be more and more difficult, improbable, and each time it will be very close to the explosive ball. Keaton makes the scene extremely long. The length of the scene makes the spectator wonder how far he will go, and especially if he has really made all his cuts. If there is a trick on that. Well, no. Keaton is simply a very good pool player. Let's play a little game. Did he really make this sequence? No, it's actually a split screen of 2 clips edited one on top of the other. Keaton was on an unbroken bridge. Did he really do this sequence? Yes, Keaton actually learned to drive while sitting on the wheel. Did he really do this sequence? Yes and no. The scene was actually shot but in reverse, so there was no risk of hitting the train and the car since they were backing up. These 3 scenes are all taken from the same chase at the end of the movie. I let you imagine the quality of this one. And speaking of chase, the transition is quite fun with the next movie that we are going to speak about. As I said earlier, the chase is one of the great motifs of slapstick, but Keaton showed a very particular iteration of it. He was chased by almost everything that exists and in every possible way. Of course by a policeman, by a policeman, by many policemen, by a cow, by cows and policemen, but also by Indians, women, dogs, ghosts, rocks, but also by motorcycle, by car, on people, and even by train. The General was released in 1926 and is the 8th feature movie of Buster Keaton. Always in this idea of not betraying what is slapstick, it will push what is therefore one of its great principles, the chase, to its paroxysm. First of all, as we said, the chase will be in trains, which necessarily pushes the cap even further from a point of view of ambition and preparation. But above all, he will make the chase last for almost the entire movie. The movie is a chase. It's the adaptation of a book, The Great Locomotive Chase by William Pittenger. It tells the story of Johnny Gray, a mechanic during the Civil War, who is robbed of his train with his wife on board by the Northerners. He decides to go after them. In this movie, the Southerners are the good guys, and the Northerners are the bad guys. I think it's important to talk about this aspect. Indeed, as Westerners, we often summarize the Civil War in a very simplistic way. The flawless anti-slavery Northerners against the ugly pro-slavery Southerners. So it can be seen as a strong political choice to side with the Southerners. But don't forget that you are in a slapstick movie, and even more so in a Buster Keaton movie. He is not interested in this kind of substantive and political issues. He chose the Southerners as the good guys simply because at the time the Civil War was recent. And he thought that taking the losers of the war as the good guys, so the Southerners, would simply make the American public more empathetic towards the characters. The movie is in fact a comeback. Keaton finds his wife and his locomotive in the middle of the movie. In the second part of the movie, they are the ones who run away and are pursued by the Northerners. The structure of the movie is in fact the structure of the Keatonian gag, turning a situation to its advantage. The first part is a mirror of the second part, except that in the first part Keaton undergoes it, while in the second part he masters it. We can compare the 2 parts quite easily. We detach a locomotive from a train to steal it, we dress with the clothes of the enemy, we recover wood from the train, we throw projectiles on the rail to block the pursuer, etc., etc. The use of the train as a vehicle will be the occasion of an inventiveness of all the moments. The use of rails, cars, bridges, it uses all the possibilities of gag that the trains can offer. This shot will be the most expensive of the silent cinema. an adaptation of a book, an ambitious and expensive work, a pure slapstick movie in its code and structure, an era feature with great battles of hundreds of extras, what if the General's Mécanique was not the most featuricial movie of silent slapstick? In 1928, Keaton released The Cameraman. It's generally considered that this is the last movie that really has his touch. Indeed, this year the MGM offers him a great contract. His friends, including Chaplin, advised him to be suspicious, but he finally signed it. From then on, he will not have any artistic freedom and his movies will not have the genius that could have before. Moreover, the arrival of talking movies stopped the career of many silent movie stars who could not adapt, as was the case for many slapstick stars.
A little choo-choo train. That takes me.
The apogee of slapstick was over. In our time, talking movies are the norm. We often hear that the voiceover is an anti-cinematographic principle, that it's too descriptive, that it's necessary to show more than to tell. Well, for the movie makers of the time, it was exactly the same thing with the advent of talking movies. In the slapstick in particular, there were almost no intertitles, no need for words, everything was obvious, everything was universal. We had reached a total mastery of this art. Furthermore, the first sound capture technologies were too imposing and impractical, where the camera had acquired total freedom in the silent era. It was extremely rigid for many years in almost all movies. These problems have obviously been solved with time. And some directors make their dialogue their trademark.
What do they call a Big Mac?
Big Mac's a Big Mac, but they call it Le Big Mac.
Le Big Mac.
Just like the voiceover, which can be used very well. But you really have to realize what a trauma it was for the silent artists. Keaton will spend the next 30 years making movies that do not resemble him, or being only the designer of gag for other artists. He became little by little forgotten by the general public. He will still have the right to return of public recognition a few years before his death in the early 60s. Movie libraries made retrospectives of him and he received an honorary Oscar in 1960. He eventually died of lung cancer in 1966. During his years of wandering, he played 3 small roles that reflected his situation. In Samuel Beckett and Alan Schneider's movie, an experimental short movie in which Buster Keaton plays a character who avoids the eyes, even from the camera. In Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, we see Keaton playing his own role as a fallen silent movie star. He will say only one word.
Pass.
And last but not least, in Charlie Chaplin's 1952 Limelight, the one and only movie where the 2 silent stars played together. They play 2 former stars who have become has-beens. At the end of the movie, they play together without words for almost 10 minutes. I've already talked about this scene in the video on auteur movies, but it's always so moving to see those 2 fallen stars playing silent slapstick together so long after their heyday.
If anybody else says it's like old times, I'll jump out the window.
Well, it's like old times seeing you here again. Put it on your wallpaper. Yeah.
I'll be down watching the other acts.
Yes, like old times.
Today, entertainment movies are sometimes looked down upon as if a movie should be profound and convey a message. A work of entertainment requires just as much skill, talent, and genius as any other type of movie. Some movie makers have devoted themselves to creating entertainment movies with all their soul and passion. And Buster Keaton is obviously one of them.